right. I never know how to do these. Like when we start off, because it's such a weird, like we've been talking for a while and then now we have to start over again. So
yeah.
Max, how are you again for the second time? I don't know how to do it.
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How's the great state of Indiana?
Indiana is, it's still all right.
State?
It's still a state,
It's still a state, yeah.
It's raining. It's like, it's not great today, but
well, we were just talking. Yeah.
We just have, we have all that anti-DEI legislation that just passed, so that's not great. But
my best friend, Crystalline Shefflin, is a professor at University of Southern Indiana down in Evansville. And she has kept me apprised of that situation.
Yeah.
My dad actually, so I'm from Kentucky. My dad was actually from Evansville. So like growing up, you go to Evansville, there's like Herbert Street there. And like, I don't know why, but like, so you see it and I'm like, man, it breaks my heart to see.
Yeah.
And it's not like Indiana's alone in these kind of debates, So
no. So so that's been the big thing this spring was all that stuff. But otherwise Indiana's fine. It's
Well, let's talk about things that won't make us depressed, which is more high schools. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, high schools.
Right. Drugs in high school and the American police state. Everyone, stay tuned for a rollicking good time with Jason and Max. It's going to be so much fun today. We'll do it up. I'll tell you what. Yeah, right. Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we have you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us who you are and like what you're doing here, and we'll jump in.
Yeah, so I'm Max Felker-Kantor. I'm an associate professor of history at Ball State University. I write about the history of policing, anti-police abuse movements, race, cities, politics since World War II. I had a first book that was kind of all about policing in Los Angeles. And then I wrote this new book that was called D.A.R.E to Say No, Policing in the War on Drugs in Schools, which is somewhere around here.
It's right here. It's actually.
There we go.
It's actually right here for the YouTube page. Right here.
Exactly.
Right here. Go on.
So this was a history of the D.A.R.E program, which a certain generation knows all about the D.A.R.E program and drugs in schools and drug policing in schools and so all of that. And so that kind of brought me to this new project and this new work. And I guess we're here to talk about a movie sort of related to this as well.
We can talk about whatever. I don't care. We can talk about Mickey Mouse for all I can. I don't know. It's my podcast. We can do what we want.
Exactly.
No, I tell you what. So I have to tell you, actually, I have two copies of your book.
And of course, the other thing that's always like, it's just the two of us, but like the obligatory thing is always at talks before things get started is always like, well, what is your D.A.R.E story, right?
Oh yeah,
that has to come up somewhere. But
we're gonna do a D.A.R.E story. Like so, so here's my D.A.R.E story. I have two copies of your book on D.A.R.E. And this is because the good folks over at UNC Press sent me like a very early copy of this, and then another copy showed up. I was like, sweet, I'll just keep getting copies of this until I can like build a house. And I was very excited because. I do a lot of UNC Press's books. I don't get paid or anything like that, but I've got a good relationship with the press over there. And there's a lot of your peers at UNC. I don't know what to say. Like your author cousins. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
They write really cool stuff, right? UNC has always been my favorite press because I write in the native South. And I saw your book. I was like, dude, I really want to get him on. So this was like a thing. Like I was like, it looked really cool. That I got to start reading. It's like, oh wait, we'll get into this, but. Your book was not about what I was expecting it to be about. And you talk about this like right off the bat, like we're not questioning the effectiveness.
Yeah, no. So, right.
So
everyone, I spent, like the last 5 years, I guess, roughly writing this book. And everyone was always, every time was like, so are you going to say whether it worked or not? I'm like, no, that's not what I want. As we'll talk, like that kind of, at least I would argue that was really decided, right? It was kind of like a historic thing, that was like, oh, this like people figured this out in the mid 90s that this did not work. And so then the book became something all very different, right?
Well, when people ask you like, did D.A.R.E work? You're like, just say no. So I'm sure we can talk about the links between all of these different things.
Yeah, exactly. I put in at the start of it, it's like it didn't work to do ostensibly what it said it was trying to do, which is about preventing drug use, but it worked in all these other ways, right? And so
And you're
whether that's
arguing. I mean, you're
police.
arguing very real. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. No. Policing, the kind of cultural impact. Like, there's almost a way that we can just say that that people continue to wear D.A.R.E. T-shirts, whether it's ironically or for parody, is like a sign of its success, like in some ways, but also the critiques of it. It's like still around. So it was successful in like infiltrating American culture.
Yeah, I associate with like a trapper keeper. It's like there's that, and you're absolutely right. Like in the epilogue of the book, like now we're spoiling. You don't actually have to read Max's book anymore.
Right. Just
buy
it.
just buy the book, right? Just put up right. But the idea is like people are knowingly wearing the shirts and then smoking weed, doing whatever, calling their parents bra, whatever. I don't know. So. But I saw your book, and usually, like when I reach out to somebody, I'm like, "Hey, do you have something in mind? Do you want to do it?" And sometimes we have to kind of reach a little bit and stuff like that. I have some scholars who are doing like books on the ocean, and there's like 4 movies that are good on the like everyone's like Master and Commander. I'm like, Mary Hicks already did Master and Commander. You can't have it, right? You can't have it's hers. She did that, then Dune. So she's got water and sand covered.
Oh well, so she's.
It's like I think she's just reaching out to do geography, history at this point in time. Her book also going through UNC Press, actually. So but yours just felt obvious, and we were kind of talking about this. You said 21 Jump Street has come up in the talks, like
So I give talks, when I've been doing talks over this past spring, because the book came out just like a month ago.
Yeah,
I mean, I've been giving some talks. Thank you. Yeah, and everyone's like, and the story I tell, and this is part of the first chapter, right? But it's like, I talk about how D.A.R.E. was a product of like police failure, but because the thing is that people learn from that first chapter is that the LAPD had an undercover school buy program. So they actually did put undercover police officers into high schools in Los Angeles, starting in the 1970s. And then that's connected to the start of D.A.R.E., or at least I argue it is. And so it's this story where then people are like, wait, they really put undercover like 21 Jump Street? And I was like, exactly like that. And there's an image of 2 of the officers, right, who don't really look like high school students if you really like look at it. But like, so it comes up, everyone's like, whoa, that was true. And then of course, you could almost say like the D.A.R.E. officers are 21 Jump Street in like a different form, right?
Full on. Yeah, it's like, and I wonder when people are talking to you, because this is such a fascinating thing for me. So I'm 46. So my 21 Jump Street is I'm a child looking at a much older Johnny Depp on I think was it on Fox back in the day, like in the late 80s, I want to say.
I don't know. So like I never actually watched the series because I'm 40, so I was like I wasn't really watching it. And then I watched a little bit just earlier today.
Oh, you did? You went back you did?
I went back and was watching a little because it was like on the streaming service or whatever. So I was like, I'll just check it out. And then, of course, then it clicked for me because I was like, oh, Johnny Depp. And then he, of course, is in the movie.
Yeah.
At the end when he comes, not to spoil, I guess the movie 12 years old. We can spoil the movie.
Okay, so people don't listen to these pods unless they've seen the film generally. Yeah. So we're not going to, I mean, it's like.
So, but anyway, he shows up in the movie as being like, oh, I was in Jump Street too. And it's like, okay. And I was like, oh, now this makes a little more sense. It's almost like they're kind of like poking fun at themselves in a lot of ways there.
Yeah, very, very violently.
Yes.
Like him and Richard Grieco both. Yes. I was like, oh, okay.
That scene really takes a turn where you're like, whoa, okay. I didn't think this was going to be like
it's
that violent. And then it's.
There's that violence, and then that precedes the man's member getting shot off. Towards the end. It's like it's like the film goes here and then it goes to 11. It's just it goes completely just batshit crazy. I mean, it's fun. It's a fun movie, and it's obviously making fun of itself. But I had no idea. So as I actually try to read as much of the books as I possibly can, usually before I do this, so I don't look like a complete doofus. And as I was reading, I'm like, holy shit, this actually happened.
Yeah.
In a way, this was a real program. I mean,
right. And so they called it this. They called it a school buy program. So, and it was specifically about drugs, right? It was like, and it starts in 1974, and Daryl Gates, who was an assistant chief before he becomes the kind of notorious police, was one of the people kind of, I was just looking at some things. He writes an editorial that goes into the Los Angeles Times in defense of undercover officers in schools, because it comes under critique, right? Obviously, is like, because they're like, we just arrested 200 kids
Bravo!
in all these high schools, and they're like, we got notes from all the parents saying thank you for arresting my kid, right? Because then it like saved them from whatever. And so, but it's just like hilarious, it's like, because it actually did happen. And so that's what, people are like, wait, there is like a kernel of truth in this whole like undercover program, right?
All right. So I have to tell you, like, I'm opening the book, I'm reading it early on. Daryl Gates, I'm like, that Daryl Gates? So I go immediately, I'm like, Rodney King Daryl Gates?
Yes.
It's like,
yes.
Yeah, that's that Daryl Gates. I was so, I mean, just shocked at like how much this man has been in like the American culture since the early 80s, I guess.
He's been like all, it's like, I mean, he was with the LAPD going back into, well into the 60s. He was one of the people who started SWAT. He was like one of the kind of people helping design that program, post Watts, all this stuff. He was William Parker's driver, at one point. So like,
see, now I'm gonna have to have you come back and do the first book, so we can do like, we have to do like SWAT or like something else, just a really bad, terrible film.
Yeah. There's all sorts of ones for the first book. I mean, like some of the straight out of Compton, and like other ones are like would be somewhat similar, but not the kind of pop cult, because that book doesn't touch on the kind of gangster rap and all that sort of stuff, but it touches on the policing. But like, there's all sorts of movies. Probably, I mean, what's the horrible one? About LA of like what's the one where they like they collide into anywhere, and it's like all these tour stories of like.
Trap. Was it Trap? No, it was a Trap. No. It was no, I know it's the one with Matt Dillon. It's the one that won the Oscar.
Yes.
And the people listening right now are like screaming at us right now.
Yes, they are.
Movies, Herbert.
Yeah.
It was I can't remember, but it didn't it beat like God, it was like it was awful. The movie was not good, and it was so overt in its. But I'm thinking my favorite LA cop movie is LA Confidential.
Oh yeah,
I mean, that's what I'm thinking. Oh my God!
Well, there's all sorts of
this movie.
I know. I'm trying to. Crash. Is it Crash?
Crash. It was Crash. It was a piece of Crash. Is what it was.
Right. Well, then we can do another one, because we're just not on that book. But we can do another one, because the new book project, which is like coming, I don't know where in our discussion.
Right.
The new book project is about this. A scandal in LA in the late 90s called the Rampart scandal. And that was one where police were literally stealing drugs from evidence rooms and framing people for, crimes and all sorts of things. Horrible stuff. And the movie that scandal is actually based on is Training Day, and Denzel Washington with Denzel, and where he wins the Oscar for that. And so I'm writing a book on that scandal, and it's kind of fallout. But
I already see a Max Felker-Kantor like trilogy on this pod. It's like you sir have now become my source of like police movies. Like, Max, I need something to get to Los Angeles. What do you got in New York? I was like, what's your next book about? So okay, please, Training Day. I'm all in. What was I watching? Yeah. We just did. Have you ever seen Devil in a Blue Dress? Are you familiar with this?
No, I feel like I know the title. I don't know the
so
movie.
It's a Denzel film set in like post-war LA, like 1948, 49, where he's a detective. And I say this because you brought up Training Day, and it's in LA, and we watched it on like the watch party on Sunday nights, this most recent Sunday, and everybody was going around like, look, young people, you are not ready for mid 90s Denzel. So it's so easy to put a Denzel Washington movie on, because it's like, here it's effortless. It's just Denzel being Denzel. It's good. So Denzel Washington is not in 21 Jump Street.
No.
For those of you still listening, starring Channing Tatum, and like one of you like Hill, right? But you were saying this earlier, like the idea that none of these undercover cops looked like high schoolers, and that's like a running gag.
It's like, it's like, and that's the thing about the 21 Jump Street, though, as I was like rewatching it. So I hadn't watched it since I lived in LA, and was like, it came out while I was living in LA for graduate school, and it came out, and I like watched it with my roommates at the time, and like, and we thought it was like fucking hilarious,
It was
right?
fucking hilarious.
And it is in a lot of ways. Some of the things don't age probably particularly well, but
Not so much.
but it was so funny. And it was like, but only now, like when I was watching it, I was like, oh, it's kind of like it's like there's that running joke about like you look like you're 40. Like look at the muscle tone on you, Channing Tatum, right? And it's like,
right.
And the whole police story of the whole thing I was thinking about was like, there's like, I'm not sure it's overtly trying to be critical, but it's like, it almost knows, it's like underlying it. It's all like, oh yeah, like the opening scene where they're like, no, I'm not the opening scene. It's like after they've been in high school and they're like the first time the two of them are like out on patrol and they're on their bike cops and there's like nothing to do and they're like throwing their guns around and stuff. And I'm like, this is like a little too on the nose, especially when we've seen all those pictures from like the NYPD and like subway cops like on their phone all the time and like have nothing to do.
Right.
And it's like, I would have to know the director and everyone more, but I'm like, are they really pointing out, like, is that a critique of the police? Like maybe a little bit. It's not like overt, but the movie's so absurd in some ways about the police that it's like, it has to be kind of this underhanded critique of cops.
Yeah. And the fact that, you choose, Ice Cube as their boss is what he a detective. He's captain. I think he's captain in this,
Captain
right?
Jump Street. Yeah.
It's the casting. I think is just perfect. And I have to, right? And there's this great line where, the guy, Ron Swanson, is like, he's like talking about reviving this new program because we have nothing new original to do. Yeah. It's totally making fun of its own self.
Right. Right. And it's making fun of the movie. But the thing is, like a police historian, I'm also like, so it's like I'm making fun of it as a remake, but it's also like that's something that police departments do. They like find new things and repackage them in the present of like, look at this new thing we did. And it's like, well, you kind of did that before and it didn't.
Oh my gosh, it's so funny you say it because I'm going to pull up my thing. So I've got a couple other like pods coming up. Like I've got Emily Brooks's book on like Gotham's lore with the book. Right. Yep, and I just had Matt Guariglia on the pod.
Yeah, I know Matt too. Yeah.
Right. So it's like all of a sudden I'm doing and those things are in New York.
Yeah.
And but the stories of like, okay, these programs will start in a city and because I and then spread nationwide. And I mean, guess what happens here with D.A.R.E, right? I mean, this is, I mean, I saw it as a kid in Kentucky and that's about as far away from LA as you can get.
Yeah. And I did it. Yeah. Right. And I had it as a kid and growing up in Salt Lake City, which I mentioned, at the start of the book at some point, I think, and that's part of the story of D.A.R.E is like, it starts in LA with Daryl Gates and then it kind of spreads within like 5-ish years. It's like nationwide. Right. And then by the early 90s, it's in like 75% of school districts. And so it's just kind of everywhere. Right. And international.
Yeah. Like how fast it spreads. So I've got all these questions for you about because I see this and as I read the book and I'm like, oh my God, the potential for this to go sideways is just, it's like, how does this not spin rapidly out of control, especially in like traditionally marginalized school districts and neighborhoods? How does this not become a way for policing to bust down on Black and Hispanic neighborhood? And I don't know, man. I'd never really thought about D.A.R.E with a critical lens before looking at your book. So congratulations. You made me think, damn you. So yeah, actually, let's just jump into that. Like, can we talk about the history? We'll get back to the movie in a second. We'll talk about what we like about the movie and all stuff. But can we talk a little bit more about, because one of the things I questioned as I was reading was like, wait a second, when was there I guess on the part of police, like the idea is like, oh, wait a second, drugs in high schools is become bad enough. It's got to be addressed. And I'm trying to think about in the pop culture, I'm thinking about like James Dean and stuff like that. Maybe alcohol or something.
Alcohol, there's a deep history, right? Of like temperance education that goes back to the like early 20th century, right? Temperance, all sorts of education like that. There's the kind of 1950s thing. And like drugs, it's kind of like, there's always been this, like, in terms of with drug education stuff going back further, is this history of like always this kind of just say no, like intolerance of drugs. But like in the 50s, a lot of the drug education is like scare tactics, right? It's just like the board of drugs, show them the drugs, scare straight, like, this is what's gonna happen to you, right? If you do drugs,
Do
you'll, like,
marijuana, you'll
yeah,
turn into a
and then
zombie.
you'll become a heroin addict, right? It's
Right.
the gateway theory, right? And so there is this, like, deeper history of, like, that sort of thing that, you could think of, like, James, like, Rebel Without a Cause, but that's about drinking, smoke,
Right.
and in the sixth and partially there's, like, in the 60s, like, there's this sort of, like, we're just showing kids a menu of drugs.
Don't do
And
this available
right.
here.
And so, like, and the police weren't really the ones doing it necessarily. They weren't the ones being, like, the educators necessarily. Like, I had some sources that aren't in the book that from the Los Angeles Unified School District where they had these little pamphlets about, like, their drug education from 1945, 1955. And it's
Mhm.
these really thin things that are like, don't do, here's what all these drugs do to you as a,
Right.
and then the 60s, there's kind of this response to it. There's sort of some brief moments of in the 70s where it's like maybe we'll do something different. Um, and then D.A.R.E comes in and it's like, no, we're gonna have this new approach, right? Back to the kind of just say no, zero tolerance. And so there's this longer history of drug education. Temperance and alcohol education stuff has a much kind of bigger kind of presence. And then it's like drugs become like post 60s, this like, with Nixon talking about, launching his war on drugs and all of
Mhm.
that. And it's like, we've got to deal with this now. Right. And then the police get involved in an entirely kind of new way, I would argue, not that they're not in schools, the police in schools goes way back, police athletic leagues, all those sorts of things. But, D.A.R.E, I think, is something a little bit different where the police are like, no, like teachers, they don't have enough expertise about drugs to do
Clearly never met my teachers, but go on. Yeah.
to do drug education. So it's this kind of this evolution of that, back to this kind of like it's a just say no program because it is like zero tolerance, but it incorporates these kind of other elements of what they call, these kind of social behavioral stuff where it's like you learn to have self-esteem, this affective education, which didn't work. There's a program that started at roughly the same time that was coming out of USC, and they found that this affective education, like self-esteem, like choice, those things, peer resistant, like excuse me, the affective side, the kind of self-esteem, they're like that stuff doesn't really work. The peer resistance training might work better, right? And all these sorts of things. So, but D.A.R.E adopted all of it. And so they adopted these parts of these programs that some of these researchers had said, like, those don't actually work, but they included them kind of anyway. So
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me, and I'm wondering, did you see linkages or parallels between this and say sexuality discussions as far as like trying to police like abstinence or sexual education in schools? Because these things kind of sound similar to me.
yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of that kind of parallel to like sex
Yeah.
education, and like Jonathan Zimmerman's written, like he wrote this kind of article where and he's a historian of education, where he actually kind of connects like drug education, alcohol education, and then sex education to kind of a similar type of kind of trajectory, right? So
Yeah.
there are some parallels in those sense of like these different ways of addressing these kind of hot topics, right? For kids.
It's like the three great things in life. Let's just drug, sex, and alcohol. They call it rock and roll, kids.
Right.
It's called Elvis studies. Um, so we get to this point, the idea of interjecting, it's so weird because you and I kind of grew up with this.
Hmm.
I can't really imagine a time when I wasn't maybe aware of D.A.R.E, at least from like the middle school era on.
Hmm.
And so this would have been 90, so
Yeah.
late
Yeah.
80s, early 90s or so. And so I guess maybe I just kind of accepted it as like normal. And this is a pretty
Yeah.
radical intervention, is it not?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing is so Daryl Gates again, like the school buy program, if we come back to that, like the actual undercover officers in schools, 10 years goes by roughly, right? It starts in 74.
Mm.
And he goes to the school board in January of 1983. And he's like, we've been operating this undercover school buy program for years. We've arrested lots of kids, confiscated lots of drugs. They have all these statistics.
Right.
And he tells the school district, he's like, but we haven't made a dent in youth drug use. And so he's like, we need an alternative. We need to deal with the demand side of drugs. Right. And so he's
Right.
like, instead of the supply, like granted, he does not say we're going to stop arresting, dealers or kids. We're going to continue that, but we also need to deal with this demand side. And so he's like, we need a prevention program to stop the users, right? To prevent the users from wanting the drugs. And so he goes to the LAUSD school board and they propose this. They partner together. They work together over the summer to create this joint program where they're like, we'll partner together. We'll create a new curriculum for drug prevention. And then the key was that Gates was like, we'll have police officers be the teachers. And that's a radical shift, right? It's like this isn't about health education anymore. It's not about, educate, other kind of social kind of educational programs, right? This is now we're going to have uniformed police officers teach this program and they say this in a lot of the literature is like, and we want veteran officers who have the street experience so that kids will believe them, right?
Okay.
They have more legitimacy because they've seen more of this on the streets and all
Right.
the
grizzled.
negative consequences. The grizzled veterans, yeah, it's like, okay. And so Gates is like, and that's the kind of proposal. We'll deliver it. And it's this idea of like expertise. The officers now have this expertise because they've been dealing with it. And like I think about this so much because I'm like, clearly some of these people are convinced that like fifth graders knew so much about drugs that they needed that they wouldn't believe a public health program or a classroom teacher about drugs, if you kept it. So they redefine, and this is one of the arguments I make in the book that I think is what D.A.R.E does it helps redefine drugs as not a problem of public health or, that sort of, or education even, but now it's a police issue, even in the prevention sense. So it becomes all defined by police, and that's a real shift, right? And of course, as you were saying, you were like, oh, this seems kind of normal, right? I make the argument that I think what D.A.R.E was trying to do was to make kids feel that way, right? To make it feel like, oh, it's really normal to have uniformed police officers around my school every day,
right,
teaching classes.
Yeah, and it's weird because now, for other reasons, obviously, as we talked about school shootings and things like that, uniformed police officers have become a fixture,
right,
in American schools, and that's a real turn. It feels,
and so that's what I suggest why D.A.R.E is a little different than previous programs, is because it was that normalized. They go in, they teach a 17-week curriculum once a week for these classes, but they stay on the schools, school campuses beyond just those classes. So I kind of see it as this entryway into that normalization, right? And then toward the end of the book, this, post Columbine, there's now it's we need these D.A.R.E officers to also be school resource officers. Right. We need to kind of so then it becomes a justification, right? Of well, look, it's good to have them on these campuses now for all these other reasons, right? And so it kind of opens up all of that way that the police then become part of the schools in a way that we see today, I think.
Yeah, you made this really. I remember actually highlighting it with this here highlighter, talking about how D.A.R.E opens the way for the foundation of the modern carceral state, right? This normalization of the police into the daily lives of children from a very early age, right? And this idea of now the police officer is the buddy in the school,
right? Yeah, because it's totally why, and remember, it's I don't have kids, so I'm always what age is fifth grade? I don't, but
10.
Young kid, right? 10, okay, yeah, 10. But it's young, and then they're also giving one-off assemblies or things to even younger kids, first, second, third grade, right?
Sure.
But and then through all of this, even at the beginning, while they're this is about drug prevention and dealing with wanting kids, they're well, the added benefit is that those kids will also come to see the police officers as people to be trusted, to be their friends, to be their mentors, right? In all these ways. And it's so interesting. I have some images in the book too about this, because like some of these D.A.R.E officers then become, they're like, I'll coach an after school football team. I'll coach a track club. They come on schools for like holidays and dress up as Santa Claus, right? And all this stuff. And so it's like, so it's infiltrating that in a way that's meant to kind of normalize and create police legitimacy in the minds of like, like 7, 8, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, right? To be like, oh, this is like, because I, like you, like when I did the program, didn't question like, oh, there's police in schools. Okay. Like they're there, they're teaching us this stuff. Right.
Right.
And I write about this in the introduction to the book, my experience. And I'm like, I just remember them trying to like, what I thought looking back now was like scaring the shit out of me that like I was going to be forced to do drugs and become a gang member.
Right.
Right. Even kind of with all the racialized connotations, right? Of like, it's those other kids, right? And so it's like, okay. But yeah, it was that like, let's make these, and there's even some quotes in the book by like the early 90s. Some of these people who are promoting D.A.R.E are like, screw the drug education. This is really about getting kids to trust us.
Oh
right?
yeah, right. It seems to be, if the idea, as I was reading through, if the idea was maybe trust the cops or normalize the police in the lives of young people was like the benefit or the secondary goal, it sure seems like that maybe started to overshadow or overtake the primary, because they realized pretty early on this is not working at all as far as keeping kids off drugs.
Yes and no, right? Like the internal kind of the evaluations done early on by the group, the kind of firm that the LAPD hires to do the evaluations, right? In the early 80s, like 85, 86, 87, they're like, this program's great. It prevents drug use. Now, of course, like they're doing these multiple choice studies or, evaluations where they're like, kids' attitudes to drugs have changed. But that doesn't mean that behavior changes, right? And that's what some of the social scientists point out later. Like, then you get these independent academic researchers being like, let's really study these programs. And they're like, yeah, attitudes. A kid may go through the program and be like, yeah, I have a different, perception of drugs as good or bad or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily change their behavior when it comes to like trying, using, right, potentially. And so, and then a whole range of other things where there's like, and so then it starts, but it's pretty quick, right? You get some negative critical studies within like 7 years of the program starting, right? By like 90, 91. And so
are the drugs that D.A.R.E is really trying to push back against, is it mostly weed in the 1980s? I'm kind of wondering how D.A.R.E evolves as drugs evolve throughout the time period, as far as like, you've got weed, cocaine, crack. Like, I don't know where this goes into schools
they
or
kind
how
of talk
D.A.R.E
about
addresses it.
like all of them in some case. I mean, marijuana is obviously one. They talk about alcohol, right?
Okay.
They do talk, like and they talk about all sorts of drugs. So it's like, there's this great quote from a teacher who's like, and the kids are even telling me not to have caffeine in my coffee, right? Because caffeine's a drug, right?
Sure.
And so,
get D.A.R.E out of our schools right now.
Yeah. Right.
Coffee.
Now that's the line.
I taught high school for 3 years. Believe me, I could not do that without ample coffee.
But and actually, like, they're not talking too much. I mean, as it evolves like towards the 21st century, right? They incorporate, like, as it is now, they've over the past 5 to 8 years, 10 years, they've incorporated opioid, and stuff like. So they do adjust. But in the 80s, like, it is marijuana. But the big thing coming out of LA is it was also about like, they were really concerned with cocaine and crack. And the interesting thing is, and it's hard because, out of all the research I did, it was very hard to find like the actual curriculum that they were teaching like in the 80s. Like, I found pretty much everything else that you could find about this program except like, here's what we did in the classroom, right? But in all the grant proposals in the early 80s, because they were trying to get federal funding, they framed it all around the crack cocaine trade and drug gangs. They're like, this is why we need, it's ravaging our cities. Our kids are, it's so they frame it that way in what, and I try to read those sources, and the way I kind of interpret them, at least, is they're using this kind of racialized knowledge of like, this is, on the TV screens at night, the nightly news at that time, you would be getting these images of largely African American or maybe some Latinx, like stereotypical gang members, right? That the news is portraying, right? And then the LAPD, when they're doing these grant proposals, are like, we have these drug trafficking gangs, which are, and they don't quite name them always, but it's like they're talking about the Bloods and the Crips, right? And they're like, they're the ones, right? And so it's feeding into that kind of fear and panics around the crack cocaine, right? Even though you're like, there probably aren't that many kids, right? That are doing crack cocaine, right? And so they're using that as a way to kind of legitimize why they needed all this extra federal funding as well. And so that's a long story, long way around of like, what drugs are they focused on? Like, they are focused on marijuana. There's a lot of fears of that gateway theory, right? Which, people, it's like, if you do marijuana, that's going to lead to this, it's going to lead to cocaine, and it'll lead to heroin, right? And so there is that, and so they're concerned about all of that, but they're talking about alcohol, they're talking about drugs. They eventually also start talking about smoking later, I think, like, as it evolves over time.
Is there a big push by the churches to support D.A.R.E? Did you come across that at all in the research, or no?
The only thing I found was that there were a few, I think, like parochial schools, like or excuse me, religious schools, in LA, like private religious schools who adopted the program, but I didn't, because this was mostly public schools. It wasn't a lot of private schools, except in Los Angeles. They had a private school program in Los Angeles. Some religious schools, I didn't see that many, but I didn't see a lot of other like churches or people coming out like for it, like in that sense.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, as a kid of the 80s, it was the Reagan and then obviously the Bush administration largely, through this time period. And I'm thinking obviously about Nancy. I don't think we can really talk about D.A.R.E without talking about Just Say
Right.
No as well, right? Because she
Yeah.
was everywhere
Everywhere.
then,
Right.
and so forth. So I was kind of wondering if this was being pushed by, say, the conservative movement of the era, or if we saw that at all.
Well, there is, like, the Reagan administration comes out and supports it. Nancy Reagan supports it. She goes and visits a D.A.R.E classroom in like 86, 87. George H.W. Bush goes and visits a D.A.R.E classroom when he's vice president. And then they hold these signing ceremonies, these D.A.R.E Day, National D.A.R.E Day signing ceremonies. Reagan has the first one, and then every year there's a National D.A.R.E Day. So you get all these. So Reagan and Bush are backing it, so to speak. And then it's really a police-led program, right? It's like the police all get behind it, and you get, conservative politicians on both sides are like, this is great.
Yeah,
So it's
who's
this
going to?
bipartisan affair,
Yeah,
because it's like, who's going to say no to this, right?
right.
But
You
Nancy
always see legal
Reagan,
drugs.
yeah. And the thing that I always have to kind of like preface is like, Nancy Reagan did not start D.A.R.E.
Right.
And Just Say No was not D.A.R.E, but D.A.R.E was like a Just Say No type of program in terms of zero tolerance. But they become kind of meshed because it's the same message. It's like, just say no. They're supporting the program, right? They're coming out, so, and Nancy Ray, as I said, like visits, they're in the kind of D.A.R.E universe, right? D.A.R.E's getting federal funding by the mid 80s, right? So they're getting this kind of drug prevention funding and things like that. So it's pushed forward by this kind of conservative movement, but I don't see it like, and there's support for it, but I don't, it's not like the Reagan administration is not like, oh, we're like out here promoting it. Daryl Gates did enough of that himself to promote the program. Is really.
Yeah, I've got questions on this effect on Gates's career as well here in a second. But I want to actually come back to this idea about using the threat of racialized violence, like Bloods and Crips and inner city gangs to sell
Right.
this against God-fearing Christians in Kansas or whatever, right?
Right.
So I'm kind of wondering, was there a difference in the way that D.A.R.E was rolled out in, say, urban communities or rural communities? How does D.A.R.E play out
Yeah.
racially to students?
It's
Is there a difference?
a really good question. It's a really hard question to answer.
Okay.
And that is like ostensibly on its face, the thing that everyone liked about D.A.R.E was what they called program fidelity, which meant they teach it the same everywhere. It's the same curriculum, it's by police officers, it doesn't matter where it's taught, you can replicate it, right? And so D.A.R.E, people love that. Like they're like, this is great, it's easy, we can train lots of cops really fast, it's easy, they can learn how to teach the program. And so there's that piece of it. And so and they're like, we don't teach it differently depending on school. Like, yeah, if there's a community, like they can substitute a lesson if they're like, oh, gangs, we don't need gangs, right? We don't need the gang prevention lesson. We could substitute it out, right? And so there's this sense of like, at least on its face, that it's all the same. But there were a couple studies. There was one study that was done, I'm forgetting if it was from Kentucky or not, actually. No, it was from Nashville. And they did an inner city school study. And they're like, and so there was some element of, they were finding that like there was a different approach in like, quote, inner city schools, right? And so there was a little bit of that, but like it was really actually hard to find any evidence of that, because they're like, no, it's taught the same everywhere. And to my kind of consternation, all of the social scientists who did evaluations of the program in the 80s and 90s, like late 80s or early 90s, weren't asking questions about race. Maybe they had some demographic data, or maybe they split things up between like urban and rural about like, did it prevent drug use differently in those places? But they weren't really thinking about like, how does this program look different, when it's police officers going into, inner cities, quote, inner city schools versus suburban white schools, right? Or like communities of color versus others. Now, that all that said, anecdotally, the people and these weren't like formal interviews, but everyone that I spoke with in Los Angeles, when I was like talking about the project, people who grew up in like South LA, South Central, and elsewhere were like, oh yeah, those cops would just come in and yell at us and call us drug dealers or drug addicts, or so anecdotally, I think there's this different way of like the police were kind of continuing that like perception of Black and Latinx communities as like criminal and kids as potentially criminal, versus like, oh, now we're going to suburban schools and be the buddies of like white kids, right?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, so as we're thinking about this, and I'm thinking about, actually the film does this really interesting stuff, kind of flipping back to this for a second. When they go back as police officers, they infiltrate. Who are the drug dealers? They're the wealthy kids. They're the white bread kid.
Yeah.
Were you picking up on
going
that
to UC
too?
Berkeley?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and the kid who died, in the film, the kid who dies at the beginning, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, not on screen, but like
after the 4 stages.
Yeah, the 4 stages, and it's like, and then they're like, "Oh, that kid looks awesome," and then he's like, Channing Tatum's like, "I could watch this kid all day."
Like, you could,
right? But then he like, the thing they learn is like, well, he's dead, right? And the captain is like, well, when white kids die, people care. Right? And so that's the kind of same message, right? It's like similar thing. It's like, now that white kids are being affected, or like, but now they're also all the drug dealers.
Right. Well, that's the central message of the film Traffic, right? Is that Michael Douglas's daughter, he's like the drug czar,
right?
And she is falls victim to, I guess, heroin. She's at a wealthy school, and of course, it's also very tropey, right? They come through, and who does he finds her with a black man? It's like, it's very crashy too. It's hit you with a sledgehammer. It's not nuanced.
Right. Yeah, but that theme does run throughout. It's like, it's the main, drug dealer kid is like, I'm gonna go to UC Berkeley, right? And all that stuff. So it's like, so there is that kind of element, right, of it's like pointing out that it's really probably, the drug problem is, in Matt Lasseter's new book, right, The Suburban Crisis, he writes all about that, right, that it was really this kind of fear of innocent white suburban middle class kids becoming the victims of all of this that drove some of these policies.
Yeah, we've got to save that group, right? This other group,
Yeah.
it almost is like, oh, this other group, it's gone. But if we can get in front of these kids, we can get in front of sadly, right? All right, I want to ask you about this. I want to ask you about this movie. We were doing a pod the other day, and we came across the thing called the codfish moment. And I don't expect you to know what this means, but essentially, we were watching this Franklin series, and they're talking about cod. And I had like 3 early American historians go, "Oh, because the fishing grounds are important," and they made a reference, and we're all geeking out over fucking fishing in Newfoundland.
Right.
However, we're gonna make this a thing. So we came with this idea of the codfish moment because we need a gimmick on this podcast. So congratulations, Max! You're the first. You get to be the first person with the gimmick. I'm so sorry. All right. So for your codfish moment, sir, after writing this book, seeing its publication, and then you went back and you and I both rewatched this film recently. Was there a moment that like stuck out to you specifically that was like, oh, wait a second, I get this. This is something I really. Were you having an aha moment anywhere in the film?
I mean, there was like the one about the kid as we were just talking about the suburban, the white kid who dies. It's like, okay, like that, for my this new project,
when they're project, like, man, go for it.
The new project when they're like, where are we going to get drugs for the party? And then they just start laughing, and you see them like going into the evidence room, actually like just taking drugs. I was like, oh my god, this is like so on the, it's like, so it's not like anyone. It's like throughout the movie, I was like, oh my god, there's like kernels of truth like in all of these moments about the police, where it's like, I was struggling, like, are they making fun of them? I'm like, I think they are, right? It's like the police at the start being like, again, as I said this already, where they're like throwing their guns around and like having nothing to do, and I'm like, that is so like just like that makes so much sense. And then like, oh, we're gonna like have these like, for my book, right, obviously the like, oh, we need like young looking officers to go into schools, right? That was like obviously like, okay, yes, this now looking back, it's like that's that program. But then it's just like a series of things throughout where it's just like the cops, like, oh, the kind of racial elements of like, oh, it's like white kids, the lack of police having things to do, right? There's like, I was just kind of writing notes here at every kind of stage, being like, this is like so on such a like critique of the
Miranda
police
rights, which comes back to hit Daryl Gates later on with King, right? I mean,
well, not specifically Miranda rights for that, right, but like just the like the like his thing about like this is an aberration, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
But like the kind of like the what I'm trying, I'd have to go back and think about like what else I was thinking about. It's like yeah, I'll have to like, but the other one that was like so on the nose too is like, I mentioned this just briefly, like, so like kind of, I guess for me at least, codfishy, I guess you could use that.
It's your codfish moment. Absolutely.
They're like, no sex with the students or the teachers.
I kept thinking that, right? And they kept playing with the teacher.
And the teacher keeps playing it up. And then like the Jonah Hill like character, he's like, I'm going to go back and actually have like the high school that I wanted to. And I'm going to like get with this like high school girl, right? But the thing is, like, the undercover buy program that the LAPD had is there was actually evidence, some anecdotal stories of police officers having relationships with high schoolers. And so it's like, these kind of, and in that case, like there was these stories of like, it was actually a female officer who had a relationship with a high school football star, right? Player. And so that moment where it's just like, okay, like they're playing into this, like, of course you're going to send cops in, you're like, don't have sex with the students, but it's like everything we know about policing, the domestic violence, right? Like the kind of sexual violence, sexual assault, of police officers. It's like, that's kind of like all there. And so that was this moment where it was like, oh, this is a little too much, right? Because they really play into that, I think, throughout the film.
This film feels, especially after reading your book, stunningly prescient, considering it came out in 2005. I think it was.
Is that what it was? Yeah, something like that.
It's been a bit, but it's like, God, this movie seems like it's got real teeth to it. In part, it's funny, but it's hitting some stuff. I want to ask you about the construction of this book. This is your second book, and I'm kind of wondering, what was the differences between, say, writing this first book or your first book and, say, this second book? Because you went back for the second book. Mm-hmm. This is a completely new project, I'm assuming. Or did it have roots in the first project?
Roots, I guess, in the first project. So, like, first book was about policing, police power, politics, anti-police abuse movements, and race, obviously, in LA from the 60s to the 90s. And so, like, that book, I mean, obviously, without getting into all the issues of, like, that was my dissertation book and all those things.
All those issues.
All those issues, which one do you want to start with, right? But
so many.
The way this book started was, like, so one of the things for that book was, like, like a dissertation was like, oh, I need to add a chapter. Now, of course, I look back and I'm like, why the hell did I write a 9-chapter book for my first book, right? Like, I didn't need to do that. But at the time, I was like, I wanted to add a chapter that dealt with the policing of kids. Like, how did the LAPD and schools and all that stuff operate, and juvenile justice and all this. So I was like, this was after I had defended and everything and was, like, done with the dissertation, but I was, like, continuing to do some research because I was leaving Los Angeles and was like, I just need to get as much stuff as I can. So I was, like, in the archive that summer after I had graduated and finished and was doing research on this juvenile justice stuff and was like, there's all these references in these folders in the Mayor Tom Bradley in his archives to D.A.R.E. And I was like, I did D.A.R.E.
Right.
So I was like, wait, like, I did this in Salt Lake City. Like, what's going on here? So that was, like, the questions that started kind of pinging around. So I was like, why am I seeing all these these pieces about, like, references to D.A.R.E. in the archives in LA in, like, 1983, 84, 85? Like, what's going on here? So I, like, I collected a little bit of that material. I was like, this is really interesting. There's a paragraph about D.A.R.E. in the first book in the kind of chapter that's on the war on drugs and war on gangs. And as I was doing that, I was just like, you know what? I wonder if there's more to this D.A.R.E., like, history. And so the construction of it, so that's where the book kind of came from, was finding those references. And then, like, so it was an LA origin story, but then the book became this kind of national story that took me, like, in all these directions, right? Like, initially it's like, okay, I'll write a history of D.A.R.E., right? But then as I developed the research, it was like, well, it kind of came together as a way of, like, well, first is, where did it come from? How did it spread? Then it's like, well, why police? And then I was like, well, there's all these cultural elements and, of, like, the t-shirts, the marketing, all of that. And so that was a kind of piece I wanted to explore. And then I find out that D.A.R.E. spun off and D.A.R.E. America became a nonprofit. And so it was this nonprofit thing that was in operation, which said a lot about, the nature of, like, governance and the shifting of the state, right? Of, like, this kind of public-private partnerships they were engaged. So it kind of, as I did some of this initial research, I was like, D.A.R.E. actually kind of touches on all these different areas of, like, the 90s, the 80s and 90s. Yeah, and it's about drugs and it's about police, but it's like, and it's about schools. But then it has this cultural element, this kind of nonprofit piece, the privatization piece, the government funding piece, right? So it kind of then came together in a way that was, I mean, much easier than the first book in a lot of ways. But the thing that was unexpected was, like, how it would spin out to, like, touch on all these different areas, right? And so that's the thing that's been always so interesting when I talk to people, is everyone kind of has different interests. Some people are like, I want to know about the police stuff. Some people are like, no, I'm interested more in the schools. Other people are like, well, it's this, like, government part of like, how did it get funded? How did it use, like, it got corporate sponsors, right? Like KFC was a corporate sponsor of D.A.R.E, right? You know, they partnered with Hanna-Barbera Productions, which did the Yogi Bear
Oh yeah,
cartoons, right?
absolutely.
And so there's a picture in the book of Daryl Gates with Yogi Bear with a t-shirt because they had him as the official spokesbear, right, of D.A.R.E. And so it spun off in all those directions, and it was like really an interesting way then to kind of think about, the primary argument I'm making is about policing and schools and the carceral state and the war on drugs, but it was really also a way to investigate all these questions about politics, culture, um, policing and all that in this moment, right? Shifting governance, all of that. I thought so. It provided an entryway into all these other areas.
No, I think that's what your book does so freaking well. It's like it just opens this. It uses this thing where it's like you go into it thinking, oh, okay, this is about did D.A.R.E work? So, no, next, all right, and then you get to talk about the cool stuff, right?
Right.
And you talk it towards the end about the rise and fall, but it's still around. D.A.R.E is not.
Yeah.
It just morphed, becomes Byzantium. I don't know what happens to D.A.R.E. Like
it's still around. So like, I mean, it goes through this series of crises in the 90s when all these social scientists are coming out and they're like, all our studies show that this doesn't prevent drug use. And then a study comes out in like 95, 96 from a person at University of Illinois in Chicago. And they're like, suburban kids are doing more drugs after D.A.R.E.
They found out how great they are.
And so that's the kernel of truth, right? Again, like with the movie, right? It's like it's like when suburban kids or middle class white kids, when it starts to, and so this news blows up again, and so it comes under fire, and eventually, like, and I make this point is that it changes in the sense that they're like, fine, we'll change the curriculum, right? We'll get a curriculum that is proven effective, and that shows that it works to prevent drug use. But the thing that's great about D.A.R.E is we have a distribution network, right? We've got all these law enforcement officers trained to teach it. We just need to give them a new curriculum. And so that's how it kind of continues on, is that it says like, we'll adapt. So it's nowhere near as prevalent as it was, right. But by like 2005, 2010, they're adopting a new type of curriculum, but they're still like, hey, we've got this great network. We're still going to have uniformed police officers teach the program. And that's how it continues, right? They still see that as valuable, right? And so the program has evolved in terms of like the content, but the kind of underlying, the kind of what I argue is one of the main purposes was getting these police to have this relationship and to be normalized continues on, right? Because it was like,
Max, you make it sound like D.A.R.E is modeled on a drug network itself, right? You're talking about like it's already got supply networks. Right. The product just needs to change. They got to tweak the product to meet the new market. I was like, oh my god, D.A.R.E is drugs.
Yeah, and they, it's so interesting because now that you say that, is like, because the way it spreads, one of the ways it spreads, the point is it spreads through law enforcement networks. Right. So it spreads. Daryl Gates is out there pushing the program. Like he's out there, he's writing articles. He writes articles in like Law and Order magazine. He writes in the Police Chief magazine. He's writing things in school magazines as well. So he's writing like op-eds and stuff.
Sure.
And he's going to all the like, International Association of Chiefs of Police. And like, he's going to those meetings talking about D.A.R.E. Right. So that he's promoting it. And as early as like 84, 85, because D.A.R.E starts in the fall of 83, 84, 85, they're already getting requests from police, from different departments to come to LA to learn how to teach the program. Wow. And then they start doing training in LA, and they also eventually hold annual conferences where they bring officers in and they do like new updated things. But then what they do is they get a federal grant to create these things, what they call regional training centers. So they actually create a distribution network where they create like 6 regional training centers across the country, where then officers don't have to come to LA. They're like, okay, they can go to Chicago, right? They can go somewhere in Boston, right? Or Virginia too, I think is one. I'm just missing the numbers off the top of my head, right? And so they actually create this network of training these officers to then go distribute this program, right? So in terms of your point, they kind of create a distribution network that's
Daryl
nationwide.
Gates' D.A.R.E. kingpin is Gates using this? And I'm kind of wondering, did you notice this? Is Gates using D.A.R.E. as a way to like boost his own profiles?
Yes.
Does he have like political ambitions?
Yeah, so
is that what's happening with him?
People thought, right, that he might want to run for mayor, right, and
Mm-hmm.
that he was using it for that. There was another officer who was very involved. His name was Glenn Levant, and he was, assistant chief at one point too. Like, and he was really the driver behind much of this. Like, and he becomes the kind of executive director of D.A.R.E. America, the nonprofit, and is really driving all of that. But Gates uses it to really boost himself, as you're asking. And one way that we see that, right, is in his autobiography, and it's on somewhere on the shelf here. I would grab it if it was closer. But like, he, on the first page of that, and it's called Chief, My Life, right? It's like the LAP, in the LAPD. The first pages of that is him describing how he is coming back to LA from Washington, D.C., where he had been there to talk about D.A.R.E. And he's coming back to LA when he gets the news of the Rodney King beating.
Okay.
And so, but it's so interesting that he actually opens this memoir of his, 30 some odd years, more years in the LAPD, with this story about, I was talking about D.A.R.E. And he frames D.A.R.E. as his like greatest thing, right? The other thing about Gates is, his son was involved with drugs, right? And so there's all this story of like, these kind of tensions, right? Because it's so, he's, and his son gets treatment, gets, does all that sort of, whereas then he's also going to Congress and telling them that the casual user should be taken out and shot, right? That's the kind of famous quote from Gates. But so he's using it, I think, to kind of boost his image at the time, but then I think also his legacy, right? Because he's like, this is the legacy I'll leave behind, right? Is this
I can
D.A.R.E.
see
program?
I could see why maybe not focusing on King as his legacy would be would be the thing.
Right.
All right, I want to ask you. As we're looking here, are there books? Are there scholars whose work have influenced your own? Like who, when you think about your own stuff and like how you think about power and police and the state, who do you like? Like,
I mean,
who should people be reading?
Right. I mean, like the book that was so influential to me as I was like, coming, this is older, of course, is like Mike Davis's City of Courts, right?
It's
like,
behind. It's over here somewhere. I think it's right
as
there on my LA shelf.
Right.
I have an
Mine's
LA
over there.
shelf.
Yeah. So I mean, on LA, on like on how the police, and how that city operates, how the police operate, is like really, really influential. Obviously, like a lot of the stuff that for the first book and things, like in the way I think about like anti-police, like resistance and movements like that, all comes from like Robin Kelly and all that stuff, and race rebels and stuff like that. But like the stuff on like carceral state power, like Elizabeth Hinton's first book was really influential, right? From the war on poverty, the war on crime.
She's come up on the pod.
Yeah, Julie Kohler Hausman's book on like getting tough, right? More recently on policing, like Alex Vitale's book on the end of policing was really great, really useful and informs how I think about a lot of stuff. So it's those sorts of kind of major carceral state books, right? I mean, obviously, like not books, but like articles, like Heather Thompson's "Why Mass Incarceration Matters" article was like foundational to like why I started doing a lot of this work. But so those are some books, I guess.
All right. Those are good. What about movies? What do you like? What do you like? I was trying to like get some books and some movies, right? So like, what do you like as far as police movies? What do you like?
I don't know.
What's your jam?
The thing is, I was trying to think about this. I was like, movies about policing. Like, I mean,
I've been watching
watching and rewatching Training Day because of the new project.
Okay,
but like
that's a happy story.
Just another wild, thing.
Oh my god!
I mean, it's less movies, but it's like the series, right? Like The Wire was like central to like
best show ever made.
I mean, this tells you about my dissertation writing. Was like I was like, I'm gonna watch The Wire as my. It's related to my writing.
Oh my god. So depressed.
So The Wire, like the new one, what is that? The new one about Baltimore. We Own This City, right?
Yeah.
I think David Simon did as well. And so it's like those things were really kind of influential on how I think about all this stuff too, right? Just like, because police movies, I'm like, now I look back at them and I'm just like, like what's that movie, like SWAT, and like there's all these, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like now it's like, now I just have this like critical eye on all these
cartoony, yeah,
right. And so
I think,
so I haven't watched any police movies recently, I think.
No, I think it's the reason why like the 70s and stuff like that do those films, because they're so gritty and just gray area and ambivalent. Maybe it's the decade of the 70s. Like I was talking to Eric Grouchway about this on the pod, when he first came on. I was like, what is about the 70s? It's just, everything's just depressing, So I don't know. All right, let's bring it back to 21 Jump Street. The big question we ask at the end of every episode here, Max, is 21 Jump Street a history movie?
I don't really think so. but it like is now, right? Like, I mean, like at the time, I don't think people would have been like, this is a history movie, right? But like in some ways now, I'm like, it tells us a lot, like about, at least in the early 2000s, maybe, like, or especially, I mean, we could talk about the series, right, when it comes out, and it's I bet that's like even more like, oh, that tells us something about how people were thinking about this stuff. Because I don't think that as I was saying, I was rewatching the series a little bit, not rewatching, watching
the series is far more serious about it.
Far more serious, right? Whereas like this one's, it's almost history in a way that's like, like the movie comes out and it's like, it's pre Black Lives Matter, right? But it's like, it's almost anticipating all these critiques of the police and like the police in schools. Of course, they're going to try to go and like, hook up with students, or they're going to like do drugs while they're there, right? And so I think, so I didn't ever really think of it as a history movie, but in some ways it like, because of when it came out, we can kind of see it that way.
That's awesome, man. I can't thank you. I was so excited to be able to talk to you. Sat down, watch this movie, laugh my ass off. I had parts where I was like, "Why am I laughing? I feel bad about this, but also no one's here, so I'm gonna laugh anyway."
Well, I was laughing. I was watching. I was laughing, and I was like sitting there. And then my partner, she comes in, and she's like, "You're really having a good time, aren't you?" And I was like, I shouldn't be laughing, but it's like fucking hilarious in a lot of ways.
It was, dude. It was so much fun. And dude, getting to talk to you and read your book is amazing.
Well.
I hope you come back on. We'll do something a little more tangential next time or something like that, and just pick something fun.